Good evening, friends. Sam Wagar here. For the last little while, I've been expanding my reading on witchcraft and folk magic outside of the Anglo European sphere. I've been interested in what uh, ideas of magic, what kinds of magical practitioners, and and so on exist in the what's called the global South, the largely poor, uh, substantially colonized, although now notionally independent countries of the southern part of the world. Countries like India, much of Africa, Latin America, and Oceania. Um, and it's been very interesting. The ideas of folk magic and the uses of magic in these contexts um, have been shaped by a very different cultural start, um, and also by the experiences of being colonized and dominated by an external culture, its religion, Christianity, for the most part, although Islam as well. And I'd like to just talk about some of the books that I've been reading and some of the ideas that are starting to form in my head about how the experience of colonization um, shapes these magical cultures, and also how ideas taken from the colonized peoples move into the metropolis, move into Europe, North America, and and shape our understanding in the metropolis of of the magic and practices in the rest of the world. I'm afraid my thinking is at this point still pretty um, partial. I'm still coming to understand how these things work. So I'm not going to pretend to have a completely coherent explanation, but I will talk about some of the work that I've been reading, and how I think we might start to better understand magic and folk magic in the context of imperialism, colonialism, and the cultural exchange that happens both voluntarily and involuntarily under those circumstances. Um, I'm not going to do as much with India because there's a very substantial literature on Indian religion, and I may have to deal with some of the books in my library a little later on. So, uh,
Since it's a Black History Month, I thought of looking for something a little bit different, but still really tied to the Black history. Understand that when Black people, majorly in Africa and outside Africa, even in the United States, we have two things that happen. One is slavery, the second one is colonization, right? So, people were left vulnerable. People didn't know ways to protect themselves. And people decided that they are going to protect themselves. And what ways can they protect themselves? That comes what we call magic. Black people, be it in the Caribbean, be it in Africa, be it in the United States, be it in Brazil, they mastered the art of protecting themselves, not to harm the colonizers or not to harm the enslavers, but to protect themselves. Understand that that was the main aim of owning all this magic. And this protection made a movement from the enslavers or colonizers. They started seeing witchcraft as something which is negative. But on the positive side, it is not what we are referring to today in the contemporary society. Today, when I say witchcraft, something never negative comes into my mind. But think about it. During that time, when a person could say the word witchcraft or use the word magic, it means that there is a person that can psychologically or socially solve problems, like bring rain, like bring good luck to the family, like protect the family from the enslavers or colonizers, those people who would have done this, done harm to them. It was actually to protect you from harm. But today, when a person talks about witchcraft or when a person talks about magic, what comes to their mind? Something negative. Brothers and sisters, I'm gonna let you watch the video. But first, I want to let you know that this video was done by a professor called Samuel Wager. Samuel Wager is a professor, and um, he talks about witchcraft and colonialism. He gives a reference from the book called Moon, Sun, and Witches, which is so much important. I want us to watch this video because this is an important part of also Black history that we need to talk about. People from the Caribbean understand this. People from African, Black Americans who are what we now call the voodoo and all these things, which we still find in Africa, right? We say people do voodoo or all these things, they still happen in Africa, but we want to like just look deeply into the historical part of this and how it used to protect Black people. So brothers and sisters, I'm inviting you to watch this video, and then I'm gonna be back. I'll be sharing my thoughts in regards to this. So I'm your host and presenter, Tech Stories. Please consider subscribing, liking, and sharing the video, and I'll be back with my thoughts in regards to this. So keep watching. I'll be back.
To start with, here's a classic work that undoubtedly several of you have already seen. Caliban and the Witch, Women, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation by Silvia Federici, uh, published by Atano Media in 2004. This is a classic study of how the witch persecutions in Europe were tied into a colonial project of the time. How ideas about witches were projected into the um, resistance of the native religions of the colonies, and how the techniques of repression used in the colonies came back into Europe, particularly regarding women and the power of women, because in many colonial contexts prior to the coming of the Europeans, um, women had a great deal more autonomy and cultural and political and economic power than they later did. The same is true, of course, of Europe prior to modernization. There were substantial economic roles for women that were taken away during the course of the witch persecutions, and which the witch persecutions acted in part as a justification for. Um, a very influential work, and for very good reason. Now, a couple of works dealing specifically with gender, uh, religion, and witchcraft in the colonial context. I'm going to just look at uh, the Spanish-speaking colonies in Latin America. Um, this one, Laura Lewis Hall of Mirrors: Power, Witchcraft, and Caste in Colonial Mexico, published by, hang on a sec, Duke University Press in 2003. Um, a very interesting book. She looks at how all three of these things, gender, uh, caste, and race, and the power structures of colonial Mexico intersected with each other in a variety of ways. Um, because of the Spanish approach to colonialization was somewhat different than the British one. The Spanish in the Spanish colonies, and also to some extent in French colonies, like Quebec, for example, indigenous people had some degree of rights. Uh, they were not on the same level as the European colonizers, but they also weren't as they weren't purely property as the enslaved people from Africa were. So they acted in some ways as an intermediary between the enslaved people and the colonizers, in particular because they in Mexico um, had and used magic. They were there was a substantial market in magic and charms, spells, which indigenous people were deemed to be particularly good at, and so the different levels of a colonial society, their popular magic and popular magic was mediated through indigenous people. Um, a very interesting and complex structure emerged. It's yes, it's worth a read. It's a really quite an interesting study. I don't want to try to mutilate it by summarizing it too much more. Um, Martha Few's Women Who Lead Evil Lives, Gender, Religion, and the Politics of Power in Colonial Guatemala, 2002, University of Texas Press. Another very focused um, study of the very similar set of links between gender, women being the principal magic users, um, and also the racial and the racial dynamics between enslaved people, indigenous people, and the European colonizers in Guatemala. Um, the Yeah, yeah. For those who are interested in doing a deep dive into a much different set of beliefs and practices around magic, um, similar to but not the same as the European cunning women and wise men acting in their because of the stronger element of class politics and resistance to the colonial overlords in Guatemala. And this one, Irene Silverblatt, Moon, Sun, and Witches, Gender Ideology and Class in Inca and Colonial Peru. Uh, what's particularly interesting about this one, published by Princeton University Press, 1987, um, is that Silverblatt looks into the structure of the Inca and pre-Inca societies. The Inca were in their own way, they were an empire, and they colonized and dominated a number of subsidiary indigenous peoples before being in their turn conquered by the Europeans. So the whole issue of colonialism is a little more complicated in the context of the Andean and Inca empires. Um, what she talks about that's particularly interesting is that there were two parallel streams of authority in the Inca Empire, which derived from the pre-Incan colonized peoples, um, that were gendered. That is, women had areas of particular power and authority, religious authority, as well as temporal authority. The queens derived their authority from being women, not from, and from the women's power structures, not from being married to powerful men. And also the men derived their power and authority through the men's religious and power structures. Um, so when the Inca were conquered by the Spanish, um, the men's power structures were to some extent reinforced. Of course, they were put into a colonial context, so the European men dominated over the indigenous men, but nonetheless, their power structures were to some extent reinforced, whereas the female powers and religion were suppressed, and that became the foundation for resistance against the colonizers. A lot of the resistance was led by women, and the women, of course, drawing power from the pre-established um, indigenous religious and power structures um, that were granted to women in the pre-European conquest period. So witchcraft in the Inca, the formerly Inca Empire, was actually the transmuted and reinforced indigenous power of women's religion in a way that it wasn't in other colonial contexts. They yes, much deeper roots. Good. By the way, all three of these books, the Few's book on Guatemala, Lewis's book on Mexico, and Silverblatt's book on the Inca Empire, are very very good histories. They all three of these scholars have dug substantially into the documents, a range of documents, court cases, of course, but also what survives of the indigenous writing, the archaeology of the era, and reports from missionaries and other government officials around these issues. Good scholarship and really quite an interesting and different viewpoint on witchcraft and folk magic, folk religion in the colonial context in Latin America. Now to swap over to excuse me. There's an emerging well, it's been emerging for a while. I guess by now it's established. School of historiography that deals with the Atlantic, certainly after, say, about 1550, as a single cultural unit, dealing with exchange amongst the various Atlantic societies and cultures, um, as a single flow of money, people, and ideas. Of course, largely fueled by the slave trade coming from Africa to the Americas, and also the trade in the various goods, sugar, rum, molasses, tobacco, from the Americas back to Europe and so on. But if we look at the if we overcome the notion of separate geographic territories, if we look at, for example, uh, 1650s or thereabouts, what's now the United States, as part of this flow of people and ideas. We get a much more interesting and complex view of cultural exchange and of the hybrid quality of the cultures, certainly in the Americas. And this is one of the books that substantially got that approach rolling. The Many-Headed Hydra, Sailors, Slaves, Commoners, and the Hidden History of the Revolutionary Atlantic by Peter Linebaugh and Marcus Rediker, published, let me just, published year 2000 by Beacon Books. Um, what a good book. um, there are stories here that, many stories that I had never heard before, but some new approaches to things that I was well aware of. The revolutionary agitation in England around um, the broadening the franchise, more rights for working class people, um, appears to have been substantially tied into the what was going on in the British colonies, particularly in Belize, at the time. Major figures in the revolutionary agitation in England uh, were from the colonies, were from Belize. Many of them were mixed race people as well. So issues of slavery and racism uh, feed into working class agitation in England in ways that previous histories have ignored or simply not noticed. Um, the the issues around the uh, convicts, freed slaves, pirates, and other minor subcultural groups in in the lead up to the American Revolution. The issues, the amount to which the American Revolution was a a class war. The class, of course, the working class failed to succeed. Um, the just the whole flow of ideas and people around the Atlantic. Really quite a fascinating little book. Yeah, it opened up a whole new view of cultural exchange and hybridity in that period of time. Now, um, yes, following up on that directly, here's Sorcery in the Black Atlantic, a collection edited by Louis Nicolau Perez and Roger Sansi, from University of Chicago Press, 2011. Um, this is just a view of yeah, witchcraft ideas in Africa and the Americas, in the Black Atlantic, which is principally the Caribbean, uh, to some extent Brazil, a lot of Brazil, and it's not just historical. It also deals with contemporary issues around candomblé, voodoo, santeria, and other African derived hybrid religions in the Americas. Cultural exchange between Africa and the Caribbean up to the present. Issues inside of notionally of communist and notionally atheist Cuba. Um, just a very interesting collection of studies of magic and witchcraft in various cultures around the Black Atlantic. Yeah. a recent and very good collection. The Witch Studies Reader, Soma Chaudhuri and Jane Ward, editors, published by Duke University Press, 2025. Yeah, it's a collection of pieces about witches, substantially in the global south, although there are some very good stuff on minority communities in the United States, on hoodoo and voodoo and so on. Um, it's yes, the pieces are fairly short. There are good bibliographies for each of the chapters and so on. Um, it's quite fascinating reading about what's going on in India, Africa, the different uh, lenses that are applied to understanding contemporary witchcraft in these various places. Um, yes, an impressive collection. The material was very substantially new to me. I'm sure that it will open the eyes of many people who think of witches as being um, blonde, upper middle class white women from the eastern United States or California. Uh, no, there's an awful lot of brown and black people out there doing magic, and in many cases running into persecution as a result of it. There are witch burnings going on in India currently, and yeah, it's yeah, to broaden your understanding. Um, uh, get a copy and read it. I have another pile of books here. I think I'll just stop with one more. War Magic: Religion, Sorcery, and Performance, edited by D.S. Ferrer, um, from Berghand Books, 2016. Um, yes, it was originally published as an issue of a journal called Social Analysis. Um, well, a very interesting collection. Um, there's this tendency, largely fueled, I think, by nice liberal-minded New Agers or something, to to think of magic as being all about healing and love of the earth and being nice to one another and all that kind of stuff, which of course is part of folk magic. But a very large part of folk magic always has been combat, working in the interest of protecting a community or a person from magical uh, or mundane um, attack. And this is a cross cultural collection of descriptions of how war magic works in different contexts. In Singapore, in Java, um, in Sri Lanka, in Venezuela, and in uh, what the hell's the name of it? Guam. The Chamorro people who they are the indigenous inhabitants of Guam, which is now, of course, a U.S. military colony, and their resistance to it. Um, Fascinating collection in many ways. The use of ordeal, of really intense experience, um, in order to become an effective magical warrior, is just it's quite startling, and it's quite good. I think that's about it. Hopefully, I haven't just rattled through this stuff too rapidly for you all. Um, My suggestion, if you want to understand magic, folk magic, is to broaden out your scope substantially. There's been some very good recent work on Anglo European folk magic, and I certainly don't say that we shouldn't understand that context as well, but it is not the universal paradigm for how magic is used, and and in particular, the magic of resistance and the magic that springs out of a reaction to colonialism, and the magic of oppressed minority groups is something that we really need to take seriously and to understand, particularly as our own world in the wealthy West is becoming increasingly difficult, and and those of us in the smaller countries next door to large aggressive countries are going to need to marshal our resources to effectively resist colonialization of our own. Anyhow, take care, gang. Talk to you soon.
Hello, brothers and sisters. Welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping that you are doing great from wherever you're watching me from. As you know, I'm your host and presenter, Tech Stories. Now, in scholarly context, what is often described as magic, quote unquote, during enslavement and colonialism is better understood as African derived spiritual system, ritual knowledge, cosmologies, and embodied practices that functioned as tool of survival, resistance, and political meaning. So, enslaved and colonized African people did not perceive these practices as superstition. And what did they consider it? They considered them as coherent worldviews that linked the material and spiritual realms. In societies where Africans were stripped of legal power, land, weapons, and formal political voice, spiritual systems became one of the few domains that could not be fully confiscated by the enslavers. And this made them especially powerful as mechanisms of resistance. However, I would like to note that for some, during colonization, it costed people lives. It costed a lot of people lives. A perfect example of history that I want to share based in Africa. When you read the Tanzania, they call themselves the Maji Maji Rebellion. The Maji Maji Rebellion, the Maji means water is a Swahili word. So the Maji means water is a Swahili word. So these leaders are used to protect, these how we call these fighters, these African fighters who fought the colonizers, who fought the white people, the Germans who wanted to colonize Tanzania. So this is what happened when they, the elders, right, sprinkled water, and they say that this will protect you from the bullets. Now, when these African fighters went there bare chested with no weapon, they were shot dead, and thousands and thousands and thousands of them died. And so I like to say that it was a weapon of them to protect themselves. However, we've had people that lost their lives when they tried to do these things. Now, one of the most important roles of these practices was psychological resistance. And it's true. It was a psychological resistance because enslavement depended not only on physical domination, but also on the destruction of the self-concept, identity, and morale. African spiritual traditions such as the Vodun, Obeah, Udu, Ifa, and Congo cosmology preserved a sense of dignity and continuity with ancestral worlds. Belief in ancestral protection, spiritual justice, and cosmic balance countered the enslavers' claims that Africans were inferior or abandoned by God. These internal resistance weakened the totalizing control that the colonial systems sought to impose. Um, Also, another thing that I want to address is, spiritual practices also functioned as social infrastructure. And I'll explain. It acted as a social infrastructure, especially within enslaved communities. Understand that ritual specialists who often categorize themselves as colonizers or they were colonized or they were categorized by the enslavers or the colonizers as sorcerers or witches. They were healers, they were historians, strategists, and moral authorities. Understand they did this to make them look negative. And when you go look at the England's history, they had an habit of banning down. You could be summoned. Let's say that they have identified that you are a witch, or they have identified that you perform magic, right? They bring you in front of people, and then they ban you, they summon you, they ban you in front of people. And that was the culture of these people, and this is how they conducted this thing, because they started seeing you having all these as evil, as negative, as people who is a sorcerer, a person who can harm people in the society. But of course, not failing to mention that we had people that harmed others in the society. But look, when we get to check the context of during slavery or during colonization, you get to understand that these people didn't have like the physical power. They only had the spiritual power. And the spiritual power is the power that they used to protect themselves. The voodoo, when the African ancestors conducted the voodoo, they protected themselves. And even look at the contemporary society. When you go to the states that are occupied by the Caribbean, especially in the United States, you are getting to understand that the recent case maintenance with the ICE issues. These states, you understand that they still perform or they still practice voodoo. Why do I say perform? I say perform because it's a craft, it's an art that needs to be learned, and it can be passed down from one generation to another. And this is how all these African ancestors and all these other group of people, they passed it down to other groups of people so that they can get to protect themselves even when an impending danger will come in future. So I hope you all I hope you all get to understand this, brothers and sisters, um, what I'm trying to like explain, right? And I hope it makes sense, all of these things that I'm trying to say. So, spiritual practices function as a social infrastructure within enslaved communities. Ritual specialists, often labeled as colonizers or sorcerers or witches, they were healers, they were historians, strategists, and moral authorities. Now, they organized communal life, transmitted and coded knowledge, and fostered unity across linguistic and ethnic lines fractured by the slave trade. They did this through songs, through rituals, through symbols, and ceremonies. Enslaved Africans preserved collective memory and convert communication networks that colonial authorities often failed to fully decipher. So, in several documented cases, spiritual systems directly supported organized rebellion. In the Caribbean and the Americas, religious ceremony often preceded uprising, serving to bind participants through oaths, shared purpose, and moral obligation. The Asians revolution, for example, is frequently associated with the voodoo ceremony that helped unify enslaved Africans from different nations under shared spiritual political vision. These rituals did not cause rebellion in a mystical sense. Rather, they provided ideological coherence, courage, and legitimacy for collective action against colonial rule. So the concept. There comes the concept of invulnerability, spiritual invulnerability, which also played a crucial role. Many African derived beliefs systems included protective rituals believed to guard against bullets, whips, or capture. So remember, I talked about the Majimaji Rebellion, the Water Rebellion in Tanzania. Also, healing practices Within these systems were another form of resistance. Enslaved Africans used botanical knowledge and ritual medicine to treat injuries, illness, and trauma when colonial medicine was inaccessible or weaponized against them. This knowledge reduced dependency on enslaved and preserved bodily autonomy. In some cases, spiritual healers also used knowledge strategically to feign illness, to sabotage plantation productivity, or protect fugitives, making healing an act of political defiance. Also, spiritual traditions also functioned as a symbolic warfare against colonial Christianity, which was often imposed as justification for enslavement. So, by maintaining African cosmologies, sometimes openly, sometimes syncretized forms, black communities rejected the idea that European religious frameworks were the sole arbitrators of morality or truth. Practices such as coded songs, spiritual and dual faith rituals allowed enslaved people to outwardly comply while inwardly resisting ideological domination. Colonial authorities consistently identified African spiritual systems as dangerous, which is itself telling. Laws banning drumming, ritual gathering, divination, and ancestral worship were common across slave societies. These bans were not enacted because the practices were harmless folklore, but because they fostered a solidarity, planning, and resistance. The fear of rebellion, magic, reflected colonial recognition that spiritual power could mobilize political action even without conviction weapons. So please let me know what you think about this. I'm your host and presenter Tech Stories, but until then, let me see you in my next video. Peace, love, and harmony. Salute.